Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I'm going to be painting up a chapter that I've had a few goes at over the years on this channel in various playlists, whether as a legion or a chapter, and that is the Space Wolves. So Games Workshop sent us through the new Army launch box for review, and one of the favourite parts of my job doing this is that you guys force me into trying out new things. So I might quite like a Space Wolf scheme I've already developed, but you want something different, and it encourages me to try out new recipes, new processes, new products, all that sort of thing. So I decided to take the most requested scheme of the last few weeks since we knew the wolves were coming, which was an approach of the grey blue, so the sort of 40k classic Space Wolf colour, but make it a little bit grittier. And I want to apply lots of the different army painting sort of thought processes and techniques that I've been using on recent videos. So that idea of making it look great on the table, great on the shelf, great in your hand, but also achievable in a realistic time frame. And also thinking about what do I really want to leave in and what actually can I leave out. So we'll go through all the important elements in the video and then we'll reflect on it all at the end. I hope you enjoy. Let's paint. So just before we get stuck into the painting, the sub-assemblies I've left really simple. I've blue tacked the helmet in, and then I've blue tacked the shoulder pads on. So the pads, because I'm going to paint them different colours, and the helmet, well in this case I am going to paint it a different colour, but also just so it's easy to get into things like lenses later on. But I blue tack it in for the earlier stages so I can make sure all my highlights and stuff line up. So the armour colour is obviously the most important element of this miniature, and I guess unfortunately I've ended up mixing it to get the colour I wanted. So you might have seen earlier I popped up a still of that image of the Space Wolf DLC for Space Marine 2, and I really liked that colour on there. I thought that's quite interesting, that's quite different. So I sort of looked at it and pulled it apart a little bit, and then I grabbed a few different GW colours and had a few different goes. So the idea with the armour is I want to get the colours right, but I also want to get that quite dramatic sort of effect of certain areas being quite bright and quite detailed, and then areas of shadow being much darker and much plainer. So for a base coat, I've gone with a 1-to-1 mix of Corvus Black and Stegadon Scale Green. And you can see I'm pointing out here where I'm going to be aiming the highlights for. So it's really useful, particularly when it's a darker colour. You can shine your painting lamp off it and it will just give you a good idea of where you're probably going to be wanting to place your highlights. And your highlights will just tend to follow the shape of the object that they're on. So if it's a sphere, then it's probably going to be a spherical highlight. If it's a tube, then it's probably going to follow, it will follow, the light will follow the length of that tube or length of that cylinder. And essentially the Marine is just a bunch of those shapes connected together. But it's always, I find, a good way to pick the model up, pop it under the lamp, move it around a bit and find out where your favourite angle to look at this mini is from. It's sort of golden angle, you might hear it called, because it's not always going to be the same on every miniature, depending on the posing, particularly how dynamic a lot of these Marine miniatures are nowadays. So I've done the base coat, and then into on top of that we're going to put our first highlight. So this is a 2-to-1 mix, so this is 2 drops of Stegadon Scale Green and then 1 drop of the Fang. Now I've thinned both of those mixtures, the base coat and this one, probably I would say at least 50-50 with thinner. Now I'm just using Vallejo airbrush thinner at the moment, and I'm spraying about 20 psi, and I'm using a 0.4mm needle and nozzle. Now you're going to need to adjust those settings to the conditions that you spray in and your tools and all the rest of it, but if you take those as a good starting point and adjust from there, hopefully you'll be able to get something that you're happy working with. And you can see with that first highlight, we're just following those shapes, like I spoke about, creating those highlight shapes on top of our base coat. And it's not a particularly dramatic stage, this one, by any means, but you can see as we compare those two models, you can see the shine coming off the one, and then actually you can see where the highlights are on the others. We've matted that down a little bit, but we're already deciding where the highlights are going to be on that miniature. We're not relying on the light bouncing off it like we do with, say, metallic paints. And now it's a case of going in and adding our highlights. So this is a slightly more involved mix. So this is the same mix as before, so 2-to-1 Stegadon Scale Green to the Fang, and then I've added in 4 drops of Fenrisian Grey to that mix. And here I'm working in closer to the miniature, and I'm just following where I've put the highlights already, but I'm making them tighter, so I'm covering a smaller proportion of the surface. So if we looked at it as 3 things, the base, the first highlight, or the mid, and the highlight colour, there's actually, you can see we don't see a huge amount of that mid-tone. That mid-tone is just to sit really between the highlight and the base coat, blend the two together and just introduce a little bit of that green, which that sort of green-blue, I guess, which I thought just made it a little bit more interesting, really. Now here I've gone back in with just Corvus Black, really, really thinned down, so probably 3-4 drops of thinner to paint for this. And it's just to pop, and if I've got a little bit broad with some of those highlights, I can just go in here with this mix and just knock them back a bit, just redress where the line is between the various stages. Then I'll go back in with our highlight mix. I may even add a touch more of the Fenrisian Grey in here and just redefine the highlights. And this is our last airbrush highlight. And it might seem like a laborious process, but actually it's 3 colours. We work a little bit backwards and forwards. But we're able to achieve that nice dramatic effect that we wanted. Then over the top of the paint, the acrylic paint, we're gonna use an oil wash. So I've chosen to use just black oil here, and the reason for that is I didn't really want to introduce any more colour into the model at this point. I didn't want to change how the colour of that armour looked. I just wanted it nice and dark in the recesses. So I've made up a black oil wash here. And to be honest with you, for most schemes, if you're not quite sure what to use, a black will work really, really well. And I've mixed it using mineral spirits, and I've thinned it down roughly 50-50. If you over thin an oil wash, it will split out, it won't behave properly. But equally, if you don't thin it enough, you're going to blob it on, and it's going to be which is going to be too thick. And just from experience, I realised that was too thick when I tested it on the rim of the dish, so I thinned it down a touch more. So you can see there I'm trying on a plastic sprue, and it's running off my brush nice and easily, but it's not separating out, giving me that horrible grainy effect. And when it comes to applying it to the model, I'm just using an old natural hair brush here. I end up switching to a synthetic brush because this brush has finally given up on me. But you see I'm aiming at all the recesses, but I'm also quite happy to get a little bit of overspill, a little bit of splodging onto the rest of the armour. I don't mind that because we're going to go back in and we're going to manipulate this a little bit further. So this isn't a super targeted pin wash. This is putting the wash into the recesses, but it's also deliberately getting sort of a little bit of that overspill on there. And the reason I've done that is I just really liked the effect we got on the Nurgle model the other week, the Death Guard model. And I thought I'm going to start working that into my models a little bit more, getting that sort of quite a dramatic airbrush highlight that for me is not subtle enough. And then we can start to use a slightly more dramatic shading using the oil. And my hope is that the two things together give us a little bit more, a nice sort of tasteful, harmonious feel to the model. So I've let that oil dry for half an hour probably. It's not going to be much more than that. I'm using normal DIY shop mineral spirits, white spirits we call them here in the UK, and they evaporate really, really quickly. So the spirits have all evaporated off, but the oil is not cured. It's sort of touch dry, but it's nowhere near cured, which means that we're able to manipulate it fairly easily. So here I've got a really soft brush. I put it in some mineral spirits, clean, and you can see when I touched it on the base, there's very, very little left on there. So I touch most of it off on some kitchen paper. And here I just go in and I start working the oil, sort of smooshing it around a little bit so that it's not covering the areas that are the brightest that we did with our highlight. And I'm pushing it down towards the recesses. And as this dries, you'll just get this beautiful, soft, sort of blended look with very, very little effort. But also what I try and do is, say the back of the legs here like this, I will try to pull the oil downwards. And what it's going to do is create a little bit of sort of streaking. It's not meant to be particularly noticeable at first glance, but I'm not really going to do much more sort of oil work and streaks and things like that on this model. But I think it gives it that nice kind of lived in feel. It still looks quite grim and gritty, but we're still getting a nice sort of bright, vibrant blue. That colour still coming through, and the streaks and stuff aren't what's initially drawing our eye or we're thinking of when we look at the model. When we look at the model, I want people to go, "Oh yeah, that's that Space Wolf blue. That's really cool." And I think we're achieving it so far. As I mentioned, or I'll talk about a little bit later, we will take this whole scheme a step further when we do some characters in a future video. Now, if when you come to move the oil around, it doesn't move particularly easily, just leave a little bit of the mineral spirit on there and go and work on another section of the model. And that mineral spirit will start to reactivate the oil. And when you get back to it a minute or two later, it'll be a lot easier to clean off. I've done one of the helmets black just because I felt like it really, I thought it might look cool. And potentially I'm considering some colour schemes for future projects. I didn't want to use the same greys that I'd used on the armour, so I've tried to stay fairly neutral. So I'm just going to use Eshin and Dawnstone. And you can see here I'm pointing with a brush. Top of his head's a nice little spherical highlight, and then his nose cone is just a cylindrical highlight. It just happens to get narrower towards the tip of it. And all the time I'm spraying about 20 psi, and then I'm just thinning the paints accordingly. And unless I'm using a Tamiya, I'm just always at the moment using Vallejo airbrush thinner. I find it works absolutely fine with Citadel paints, my AK paints, my Vallejo paints, so it's just easier to have the one thinner on the desk. And here I'm just checking back on the model that the highlights are lining up. For the yellow shoulder pads, wanted to keep it nice and simple. Again, I'm kind of on this journey at the minute of how much can I leave out before I don't like the stuff anymore. So I'm trying to keep every stage to the absolute sort of bare minimum that I'm happy with. But what it means is that each stage has to have real impact. And I find if you want a nice kind of warm, punchy yellow, for want of a better term, using like a magenta or something like this, Screamer Pink as a pre-shade colour really does help. It really helps pump up that colour a little bit. The shoulder pad actually is a great one when we hold it under the lamp that allows us to see where our highlight should go. So I'm just going to colour that highlight in now using Tamiya Flat White. This is my favourite paint to use for pre-shading, but because it's Tamiya and it's Tamiya's acrylics, we need to use Tamiya's acrylic thinner, which is X20A. Other than that, you treat the paint in exactly the same way we would all our other water-based acrylics. We just don't mix it with our water-based acrylics, and we use the correct thinner with it because it's got a solvent base to it, or alcoholic sort of base to it. So you can see here I've thinned this probably 3 to 4 drops of thinner for every 1 drop of paint. I apply a nice bright highlight initially, and then all you can see I'm doing at the back of the pad there is just giving it a thin coat just to knock it back, just a touch, so it's not that pure Screamer Pink underneath the yellow. Now, I got a big colour swatch page I made up when I first got the contrast colours, and I finally ran out of Iyanden Yellow recently, so I rebought a pot when I was at the store. And this is my first time of using it, and it's not really the same yellow, but it's really nice, which is fine, but it's definitely more orange than it was when than the first pot I've used, but still a lovely colour. So I've thinned this, I don't know, a drop or two of thinner for probably 10 drops of contrast paint, something like that. Apply a coat, let it dry, and then decide if it needs more, because you see there's a huge difference between 2 coats on the left and 1 coat on the right. And I think in the end I went for 3. And for the Grey Slayer, he's got a red shoulder pad on his right hand side. And I wanted to keep it really, really simple. So again, a grayscale pre-shade. No, I suppose it was a pink scale, wasn't it, last time? But this is a grayscale pre-shade, so we're going straight over the black primer and then just using the Tamiya Flat White to create the highlight again. And I'm going to use Mephiston Red. 2 reasons, really. One, it's a lovely, boring red. And secondly, it brushes on very well. And I want to apply some red markings on the model elsewhere. Originally, I was going to do it on the chainsaws, but I didn't in the end. I quite like the runes. But I need to put some of the sort of red dags on the yellow pads. And I want to use the same paint. I'm really trying to get in the habit of, with army painting stuff, to have as fewer paints as possible and to use them wherever I can on the model without getting another paint out. Again, just to simplify that process, so it means that the desk isn't so cluttered. It means you almost, I now just have a little dish with the paints I'm using in on that project. I keep them in that dish whilst I'm working on it, and then I put them away in the rack at the end of it. And I just quite like that. I guess I'm forcing myself to try and be a bit more neat and tidy. But it's something our commissions chief Ben sort of mentioned that he did. And I quite like the idea of it. And it certainly made me, again, think about what paints I'm using. Why am I using them? And then for freehanding on the various dags, I'm not big on freehand, but this seemed to make sense to me to put a center line for the triangles and then build them out from there. And then if they weren't quite right, I could make them bigger. But rather than trying to say start from one side and then not getting the 2 angles to match up very well, or, starting it too big and then not being able to make it smaller and all the rest of it, this just seemed to work for me. I haven't touched the brush for about a week before doing these minis. Oh, sorry about that noise. It's my airbrush compressor kicking in. Always turn your compressors off. Otherwise that'll happen. But obviously not when you're using them, but when you're finished, let the air out. I can't think what I was saying now, but yes. This went nice and smoothly, which was fab. I think when it comes to freehand and stuff, you just got to get comfortable, right? But certainly one thing I found, not just necessarily freehand, but certainly when it comes to painting details, is much like when I'm airbrushing, is to move the model around so that my brush hand is comfortable rather than brushing awkwardly. And it might sound obvious, but for me, it's definitely a conscious thing that I'll do. And I'm always basically trying to draw my brush so it's in line with my wrists, so my hand and my wrist sort of stay straight in line with each other. And I just find it comfortable to paint with, and I find I have a decent level of control. And also just points of contact. So, hands are together here, my elbows are tucked into my sides. Just trying to reduce movement and increase the points of contact and therefore stability. The red dags didn't come out amazingly. It was really awkward actually trying to draw the line on a surface that was sloping both left to right and sort of front to back. But once it was all done, it was time to pop the decals on. So I gave it a good few coats of polyurethane gloss varnish. It's a nice hard-wearing varnish. It's not going to react with anything you put over the top of it, like the solvents, the decal solutions and stuff. So that's the one I like to use when I'm doing transfers. Now, when it comes to the rims of the pads, we need to match that colour in to the rest of our armour. Now, we could, as I've done in previous videos, paint that yellow in initially and then use, say, a masking fluid to do it. But to be honest with you, it's a bit of a faff, that whole process, and I am comfortable matching it with my hairy brush as I'm doing here. So I'm using exactly the same colours as we did in the airbrush, but I'm just going in, applying them where I want them to be, and then using a thin down mix to blend them together. I'll link up to a power saw video that we've got that should help explain this process. But it's just sort of simple layering and glazing to blend it together. And the manner in which I paint and do battle damage and weathering, it's very easy for me to sort of hide any sort of slightly rough transitions and stuff anyway. But yeah, that's why I've chosen to do this. But if you're not that confident with this technique, I mean, one, practice it because it's really, really helpful. I have certainly found it incredibly helpful to become proficient in. But yeah, if you're not comfortable, just do, as I say, do the masking process. And then I've used the black oil wash over them as well, so just to make sure we tie it in as close as we possibly can to the rest of the armour on the model. And once all of that was dry, it was time to do some battle damage. Now, initially, I've decided to do a little bit of sponge chipping. Now, you'll see I'm trying to only apply these chips and stuff, generally only applying them in the areas that I have highlighted, which is why I've gone right the way up to the brightest chipping colour. If I was going to be chipping in the shadows and the areas of mid-tone more, then I would have gone for a slightly darker colour initially, and then I'd have done this Fenrisian only on the harshest points. But again, it's something I've been trying to do more, see if you can sort of miss out that middle stage, skip straight to this one. Do you still have the same impact? And then I'm going to go in with my brush and just add to those chips. The sponge allows us to create really random looking chips in quite a controlled manner, but I love brush chipping as well, so these little tippy-tappy chips all along the edges, kind of like edge highlighting, but nowhere near as laborious or time consuming and tricky, if I'm honest, but still I think quite impactful. If you're not comfortable doing these, then the sponge chipping will still look great. That's absolutely fine. But one of the elements with the brush is it just allows you to get into areas like this on the feet and the bottom of the shin and stuff, which I wouldn't be able to get into with a sponge. You'd end up sort of hitting the areas around it, and it would look like you'd blobbed a sponge on there. So that's why I like combining the two. And I've just got the Fenrisian Grey on my wet palette. It's probably diluted, about 1:1, maybe slightly more paint than water, because I want it to come off the brush easily. I don't want it to dry too quickly, but equally, I don't really want to have to do more than one pass with the chipping. So here we can take a look at them, and hopefully you can see what I'm talking about with really only doing the sort of chips and stuff on those areas of highlight, to really sort of try to concentrate in on almost saying this is the exact place I want you to look when you're looking at the model, and don't worry about what's going on the rest of it. For my taste, I think it's, I say, a touch too far, but it's certainly effective, and it's certainly a rapid way of getting things done. So you can see that whole area in there I've just done nothing with. Generally, in the past, I would have done a little bit more sort of in that area, but would that matter on the table? Across an army? Do on characters, sure, but across the squad on the board? And the time saved would probably allow me to paint over an army, at least an additional squad. So yeah, maybe it is worth it. But you see what I mean there, where I'm working with the brush. There's really is a sort of focal sort of line down the model, almost sort of spotlight. Now, one thing, obviously, I realised once I got the pads on there was that we haven't battle damaged them up. And we need to, in my opinion, they want there to be some sort of consistency across the model with what you do. Now, I've chosen to, this is something I like to do a lot actually with contrast paints, is mix in an off-white, usually a similar sort of colour. So say it was the red, I would mix in, say, a pink or an orange. If it's the yellow, I'll mix in a light yellow. If it's green, I'll mix in like a minty green colour, that sort of thing. And you just mix that into your contrast paint, and that sort of thicker off-white highlight paint, coupled with the contrast paint, tends to give us a really, really great highlight colour and paint that's very, very sort of usable. It's nice and fluid, but it's also sort of opaque enough to not have to do it too many times. Now, yellow over black, you're almost always going to have to do a couple of coats anyway. But here, you know, see, we're not doing too many scritches and scratches. It's just enough to make sure that those pads don't stand out as looking obviously different. So we spent a long time on the armour, but it's most of the model. So I don't really mind that. There's certain details though I did want to just sort of cover with the tutorial. One thing I will mention is when it comes to painting the backpacks, often I will blue tack the backpacks on, but I will nearly always blue tack the shoulder pads on. And the key reason for this, for me, is getting to the little metal exhaust parts on the backpacks. I nearly always, when I paint these in, I nearly always end up hitting the back of the shoulder pad and getting like a metallic blob on the back. So yeah, I either have the pad blue tacked on, or in this case, I've got the pads blue tacked on. I'm just using Metal Colour Series Burnt Iron here. It's a very, very similar colour to something like Iron Warriors from Games Workshop, but just use whatever silver you like, really. I like using this from Metal Colour Series because it's very, very fluid, so it comes off the brush really easily. It covers generally in sort of one coat. So again, for things like army painting, it's really good, and it's a nice dark silver, so it takes a wash well to go darker, but also highlighting it is pretty easy. Now, for the leather parts on the model, I chose to do all the leather the same for efficiency's sake, but I've chosen to use a recipe that I'm comfortable with and I know I like the look of, which is this Thondia Brown and the Steel Legion, but also I wanted to choose this because it's a lighter brown leather. I didn't want to go too dark. I already felt that the armour colour itself was pretty dark because I have left so much of that shadow on the model. So I didn't want to do like a Rhinox hide sort of base colour for the leather. I wanted to keep it a little bit lighter, so we got some sort of variety and of value on the model. So just a simple base coat of the Thondia, and then again a simple little tippy-tappy, scratchy highlight with the Steel Legion. And you can possibly tell I haven't painted for a week because I'm constantly moving the models out of shot, which I'm sorry if that's annoying. Now, eye lenses is something I've been really enjoying painting recently, and over the years, but particularly recently, I've tried to be zoning in on this effect I like that I saw in the old Imperial Armour Badab books. And I want to try and keep working on that because I want to become proficient at it. I want to find a way of army painting it for myself. And because I would like to do a Marine army over the next 12 months, whether that's a Badab project or a Heresy project, I'm not sure at the moment, but I'd like to do one. I haven't done one for at least a year now. So I've thought about another approach to it. So rather than building the colours up, say like I did in the recent Wordbearers video, I thought I would try and do kind of appreciate really. So I'm going to use here a light green and then the Dawn Yellow that we had already. I could probably have just used the Dawn Yellow. The reason I didn't use it straight away is because often you'll find with white paints that because the pigment's quite thick in them and all the rest of it, they're just not necessarily the easiest to thin down and work with. But I found that the lighter green here, Scarsnip green, I think it was a Warboss green, one of those, just was a little bit more, just easier to work with, basically. So I didn't mind adding in one more paint to this process. I'm going to do green for the eyes because I like how the green looks. I know red's on the box art, but I like how the green looks. And the major difference here is rather than painting light towards the middle of the face, so towards the nose, and then dark towards the outside, and then putting a light dot in there and all the rest of it, I'm here painting the brightest point is in the centre of each lens. And then what I want to do after that is put in a highlight line all the way along the bottom of the lens. Now here I'm going back in with the black just to tidy up the area, and I've left nearly this entire process in real time, so you guys get an idea of how long it's sort of taking. But this was the first time I'd ever tried this on this head. By the time I did the third head, I was flying through it. So this has by far and away been the best part of doing this little project. This is what I'm going to pursue as the way to do this lens technique. So I think it works really, really well for what I want from it. And there's no getting away from the fact that you need a steady hand, you need decent brush control. So if you're not confident with all that, then I would suggest you do something like pop a little white ink in there and then pop a little contrast over the top. It will still look great. If you look at those Emperor's Children I did recently, that's all I did on there, and I think it's really effective. But this is like one of my favourite things for like how a Marine looks, particularly when we do it on a Mark 7 helmet or this sort of Mark 7 homage Primaris helmet that they've created. I just love it. So that bright in the middle, bright line underneath, and then again, don't be afraid to go in with your black paint and just tidy things up. It was very strange painting a Primaris Mark 7. I've been putting Mark 7 helmets on Primaris for years now, but it's quite strange having I guess it's Mark 10, isn't it, Primaris armor? So having like a Mark 10 but blended with the Mark 7, it's cool. It's great to see that they've recognised that, you know, we love that. We love that helmet. And then for the green, I decided to use Karandras Green. It's one of the sort of second wave of contrast paints. They're sort of even more saturated, even more ink-like. And by absolutely the second this went over, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Even though I'm about 2 foot away from this model when I'm filming, which makes doing eyes really hard for filming. I could just see from that it looked great. And I love that. And I think, yeah, it was easy to work with that sort of light green and light yellow. It was easy to touch them up with the black, and then 1 or 2 dots of the contrast over the top to get the colour I wanted. Wonderful. Rather than playing around with, say, 3 or 4 different greens and building it up and all of that. So, yeah, really, really happy with that. So now I've got the model sort of all put together. I'm going to give it the whole thing a satin varnish because we've got a few different finishes. We've got obviously where we did the decals. We've got some bits have got the oil on, some bits haven't got the oil on, all of that. And I thought I just want to unify the finish a little bit here, just to make it a bit nice to look at. And again, I'm enjoying using satin varnishes at the minute. I think for tabletop stuff, I think I prefer what the satin brings. I think it gives the shadows a little bit more life. I think it gives the difference between the highlights and the shadows a bit more punch as well. So I'm just enjoying using that satin sort of varnish to give me the finish. And then lastly, because some of the areas haven't got any oils on, and washes are a very effective way of harmonizing and sort of blending things together, and also just a really easy way of making metals look a bit more interesting, I've just done up a simple brown wash here, so made much in the same way as the black wash. And I'm going to apply that all over the metals. And then I'm also going to apply it over the yellow shoulder pads. Oh, and it turns out over the red shoulder pad as well. I mean, you can stick this anywhere you want. It's just dirt and grime. It's basically like an Agrax, but it will behave slightly differently because it's the oil. And much like the black oil, when I placed it over the yellow pads, I did go in and just clean it up with a brush as well, just to check that the nice highlight still came through. And again, don't worry about varnishing or anything like that. You don't need to. As long as your paint's dry, your oils and stuff aren't going to react. And there we go. That's them all done and on their bases. So the bases, I've just done that classic style that we do on most of the YouTube videos. There's a video all about how we do that, but also in a few weeks' time, or however long it is until we get that next wave of walls, so the character stuff, I thought I would paint up one of the character models, much like we did with the Emperor's Children recently, where we'll look at how we take this scheme a little bit further and spend a little bit more time and care on our characters, and I'll cover the basing in full on that video as well, just for sort of completeness sake. So yeah, how do I feel about them? Pretty good, to be honest with you. If I'm honest, this is a bit of a strange journey I'm on at the minute, this trying out slightly different approaches to things, but I'm really, really enjoying it. And one thing it's giving me the confidence that actually over the next, say, 12 months, maybe there are a couple of army projects that I will actually get done. And that's a real sort of thrill. You know, I haven't covered every single element in this video. You guys have sort of said in the past sort of month or two that you prefer just focusing in on a few of the key areas in a little bit more detail. But for instance, elements like the silver on here, the brass colours on here, all of that, it's literally just one base coat and then the oil wash, and that's it on them. So there's certainly areas on here that I think I would prefer to take just a little bit further in certain places to make them satisfying. And I thought putting them next to this Wolfspear guy that I did a month or two back would be a good way to look at it, because I already was changing the approach to how I was doing certain things on the Wolfspear guy, which you'll know about if you've watched that video, and I'll pop the link up to it here and in the description. But it's interesting to see how I find it interesting anyway, how that has developed even in those few weeks since doing him. And to be honest with you, I think I prefer the execution of the Wolfspear miniature, but that may simply be that I just prefer the colour, because I'm not someone who loves the blue-grey Space Wolves. You know, for me, when I sort of fell in love with Space Wolves, and there's something I really enjoy hobbying with, it was with Heresy, so it was with that more sort of storm grey or lighter grey, or certainly not a blue-grey as such. But we've got new Heresy on the horizon, and do you know what? I probably will do another Space Wolves video for their Legion scheme in the not too distant future as well. So yeah, there's always going to be another grey scheme to have fun with. But I think one of the big ones for me, looking at the two of them, the armour I think is great. The leaving those sort of areas of relief, I think I've gone slightly too far on the 40k Wolf, whereas on the Wolfspear model, I quite like that there's that little bit higher level of execution and detail on the back of the miniature, rather than just sort of leaving it purely blank like I have on the 40k one. But, you know, the metals as well, I think the metals benefited from an additional highlight, so that's definitely something I'd consider, and I don't think that's particularly time consuming as well. And I guess what it's teaching me is that when it comes to leaving things out, that's probably going to differ project to project. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. As usual, if you've got any questions at all, pop them down in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And as ever, a huge thank you to those of you that support us over on Patreon. So if you'd like some additional content, it's usually by Andy, which are a bunch of videos each month focusing in on often on display pieces, but I know he's got a few army painting projects coming up as well. Then yeah, we just hugely appreciate that. It allows Andy and myself to do this full time. It allows us to bring on Ben to be doing it full time soon, put on things like the MPO, have a play around with the podcasts on Twitch, all of that, and it wouldn't be possible without you. Also, if you can't support us on Patreon, then your likes, your subscribes, your comments on these videos, they make a massive difference as well, just to help improve the visibility. Thanks ever so much for all of your support. Take care, and I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com, and maybe Ben can sort you out.